Greetings, everybody. Little show and tell after our webinar here. Picked up another one of these, you could say Chinese, Japanese sword guards. I started really my interest in these when I was starting to do more design work. Of course, having studied Chinese arms and armor for a long time, I've always been interested in all the aspects, including the decorative aspects and what we see in sword guards. And I'd always heard, I mentioned this before, I did also talk about a Ming period guard before, so you may remember that. I gave a little show and tell on one that I believe is from the Ming period that was also ended up as a sword guard in Japan. But I recently came across this one, which I'm really happy with, really caught my eye. Talk about why in a moment. And my interest in these comes from, as I started to do more sword design work for people, you can only do so many things, I want each one to be unique, but also historically accurate. And I thought, well, dragons are really nice, but there's only so many ways you can make, a pair of dragons. So how am I going to vary designs for people? So I started really doing a little more research into these guards. And something I sort of heard about and learned a lot more about is that there are these Chinese export guards. There was actually quite a industry, you could say, for these guards. Because of this industry, there's a lot more guards, it appears, than other fittings. Now, it's 100% hard to say because these are talking about things from the 17th, 18th centuries, even though maybe into the 19th century. And so with these guards, how do you know, did they come off of Chinese swords where there was a whole set of fittings that matched, or were they made for export? Some of these we're pretty sure, it's hard to say for absolutely, but we're pretty sure that they were made for export. But before we get into that, maybe a little more background, because it's going to be important when we talk about the details, the decorative details of this particular guard. During the conquest period of the Qing, there was no trade. The Chinese, I wouldn't say it wasn't any trade, but there's no official trade. There was a maritime restrictions because the Ming loyalists had Taiwan, and there was the southern coast at the time was controlled by those loyalists, and so the Qing court didn't allow trade, and they moved people away from the coast. Later on, when things were settled during the Kangxi period, they realized, hey, we're losing a lot of money here. There's a lot of trade that was back and forth, and so during Kangxi's reign, they reopened up that trade. And there was so much trade back and forth between China and Japan, including of these guards, that there was a Chinatown in Nagasaki. And very quickly, within a few years, the population of that Japanese city, Nagasaki, was 10% Chinese, and it might have gone up to around 20% Chinese. There was a walled area that was the Chinatown for Nagasaki. But what's interesting is, of course, it grew, Chinese population grew to such an extent is that it went outside those walls. So there were a lot of people there doing trade back and forth, trade of these kinds of things, these export guards, as well as many other things. And carvers moved there and produced Chinese swords guards there. And that's well known. So that's a little bit of the background. Why are we seeing these Chinese style guards on Japanese swords, and how did they get there? And where did they come from? So some of them were exported directly from China. Some of them were Chinese carvers working in Japan. Having said that, there's a number of really interesting features about this one. First thing is maybe, of course, how do we date this? It's really tricky to date any sort of antique at all, because at any time, somebody could make this. I mean, somebody today could make a guard exactly like this one. So how would we know? And they could, there's ways to add patina. So how do you know? Is this a real one? Is it an antique one? Etc. Well, one way you know it's antique is if somebody were to make this today, it would cost you hundreds of dollars. It might cost you $1,000 just to have this iron carved. I mean, there's a lot of very detailed carving. The heads of the dragons are really finely done. All the arabesques, all the little carving of the vines is very detailed. You can see the front and back are different. This is the front. You can see how the tail of the dragon is on top of the vines, and here it's below, so it's not perfectly symmetrical. It's undercarved and carved around. We know that it's probably a Chinese maker, and there's another question. Is it a Chinese maker, whether it's in mainland China or in Nagasaki, it's a Chinese carver, or is it Japanese? Because this, what the Japanese would call a seppadai, this washer seat, right? This is this rectangular area right here in the center. That's the part that goes right up against, there's a flange there on a Chinese sword, and it has to seat in. Here, obviously, with the edge up, it was set to go onto a Japanese sword. Also, you can see the way this opening was carved for the little utility knives that go on the side. But it looks like this one was done. When you look at it carefully, it looks like that was done intentionally rather than cut out later. We'll come back to that in a moment. But because this is rectangular, that tells us this was somebody who was probably Chinese, might have been working in China. Again, it's hard to say for certain, but if they were working in China, they did them the way they did in China. The Japanese ones, and later on the Chinese ones as well, are ovals. So it's unlikely that this is a Japanese carver copying a Chinese style of guard. Also, and this is obviously somewhat a matter of opinion, when I look at the way the dragon is done, especially the head of the dragon, to my eye, that's a Chinese hand. Somebody else may have a different opinion. It's, that's kind of thing like, well, how does it look to you? But when you've seen a lot of these, you go, okay, those ones, that's definitely a Japanese one. These ones we are certain are Chinese, they're on Chinese blades. Then you start to see these little stylistic differences. And in my mind, the way that head is there, that is a Chinese hand that did that. That's not a Japanese carver. Other things now, so when does it date from? As I said earlier, it's very, very difficult to date anything. Anybody at any time can make something that looks like an earlier period. But generally, because this was something made for export, this is sort of like, what's this year's fashion? What shoe style is in? What, thin ties, wide ties? Same thing happened in swords and swordsmanship and everything else. What style of fitting is popular these days? And so Japanese swords, where you can change the fittings very easily because the hilt slips off, you could change things up. And also, depending on the samurai's class, lower guys would have very simple guards, but they might have had a fancy guard that they used when they went to see their boss, the daimyo, whoever. If you're upper rank, you might have something that's very fancy, but you wouldn't maybe use that every day. You'd have something simpler for when you're out in the street. So they could change out these things. So what date is this? And I'd say that if we accept that, okay, they're making them in large number according to the current style, stylistically, this is of the earlier 18th century. So early 1700s. The reason why I say that is the style of the dragon's head, it's very much in the Qing style. It's not a Ming style. You look at the way the head is and the comb comes back and that. You look at different dragons over different periods, how they changed, that's more of that Qing period. Also, though, while these arabesques, this vine work is all really very detailed, it's really, really, finely done. Well, that's all, really, really beautiful work, nice work. It's not overgrown. And what you tend to see as the dynasty goes on, later in the period, especially during even the Qianlong period, that they become more and more complex. I don't particularly care for those as much because it's like these vines have overgrown the dragon and you barely see it. So I like this. You can see the dragon very clearly, but you have very nice work. So thinking about some of the curious details. Now, first thing is, this character here. So we have that stylized long life character there at the base. Also, what's really nice about this one is, this is gold here, along the dragon's tail, that's gold, and this pearl. The dragons, when they're coming up like this, they're contesting for that pearl of wisdom, so that's gold. And on both sides, it's in really nice shape. The gold is really intact. Couple other things, though, that are unusual about it. The first thing that makes me think that this was a carver, Chinese carver, in Nagasaki. Now, when I say that, we're just looking at the bit of evidence that's here. This is no way I can prove this, or anybody else. Somebody else may look at it and have a different opinion, and it's just based on what their eye is seeing. But when I look at this dragon and I look at the tails are relatively fat and stay even. If you see the tail there, as you look at those tails, they stay pretty much the same thickness as they go down. And that reminds me very much of the Naga. It's a kind of serpenty, dragon kind of creature, or mythological creature that you see in Southeast Asia. It's more like a snake or serpent, has a dragon kind of head there, but the body stays about the same width, and it has the kind of scales go down really evenly down the back there. So this is a very typical sort of Naga. And there you see them in Thailand, you see them in other places in Southeast Asia. Now, looking at that, you may think, well, okay, that, the tail does look kind of like we have on the dragon. What makes you think that that's your dragon here has a tail that came from a Naga or is influenced by Naga? And the reason I suggest that, obviously it looks like it. You could say, well, why? Maybe the carver just chose to do that. It's possible. But I think that that's influenced by those because there were a lot of guards being imported into Japan during this period. So we have guards showing up in Japan that are Vietnamese, from other places in Southeast Asia, and I think these are very interesting because they're sort of copying styles like this. They're copying Japanese styles, but they're doing it with their local hands. So an artisan who hasn't been living in Japan, isn't very familiar with Japanese art, who lives in Vietnam or other places in Southeast Asia, is going to depict the dragon or whichever creature the way they're used to depicting them. They're not going to know exactly how it's supposed to look in Japan. And you see these little sort of differences that allow you to say, hey, or suggest that this was not a Japanese carver, it's somebody else. It's either from Southeast Asia, where they're importing these guards from, or somewhere in China. Why do I think this was a Chinese guy not in China, but in Nagasaki? Is because the carver there probably would have seen other guards coming in. Because remember, he's working at a company. These were done in like basically sort of craftwork factories, you might say. And so when these were done there, they're going to see other guards. And so that's probably, he saw the Naga, saw how those tails look, and did that there. So, but again, to be honest, in all fairness, somebody else may look at that and go, I don't see that at all. That's the nature of these things, which is one of the things that I think makes them very interesting to study, and why, you can find similar guards like this now and then are not so hard to find. But why did I want to acquire this one? Because of these little details that are different that make it interesting. One last thing I wanted to point out here, which again makes me think that this was not a piece made in China, but a Chinese carver in Nagasaki, is this cross right here at the top. You see here this cross? Now, somebody may say, yeah, that's a cross, but is it a cross? It's very thin, it's on both sides. Now, you'll know that in Japan, 1614, the shogun started repressing the Christian religion in Japan, and eventually it was banned. I forget exactly when it came back, but of course, many people who were forced to renounce their faith, but be that as it may, some samurai who had converted to Christianity could no longer outwardly display any kind of Christian symbols. You couldn't wear a cross or something like that. But they did sort of surreptitiously stick them in little places here and there. And it's not uncommon. If you want to go out and search around the web, you can find tsuba, Japanese guards made in Japan, that have crosses in gold at the top. And they're very obviously crucifix. So those people who didn't give up their faith, but couldn't, really be so public about it, they'd have little things like this. And so this one, it's a very small piece, but it really looks like a cross to me. Now, why is there a cross on top of the Pearl of Wisdom? So I'm suggesting that this might have been made locally for Christian samurai in Nagasaki, but Somebody else may go, that doesn't look like a cross to me. So again, that's what I find really interesting about these things. Some days you look at it and go, what is that? Other days it makes sense to you. But it's a bit of a mystery, a bit of a puzzle. So anyway, but time-wise, I'm pretty certain I'd bet on that early 18th century. Thanks, everybody. Till next time, stay strong. 再见.